Okay, I pushed the switch. Am I on? Well, nobody's rebuking me, I guess so. In connection with what Miss Anna just showed us, I'm going to ask Malachi to run a video here. There's a factor in this story. A shofar is a very important part of this. And kids, you might want to watch this. Go ahead and run it. If you can get it to play. Okay, kids, now you know what to get for Christmas. Actually, I found out that Malachi plays the shofar. Son, if I'd known that, you'd have been here playing it this morning. But shofar is a very important part of this story. So kids, I think there's a space on your paper, another place where you can bring up other things that are mentioned, and you might want to keep in mind the shofar. It's those who don't know, it's a ram's horn, a goat, a wild goat that's been hollowed out to be played. They come in, handy size, or you can play with one hand, or he comes very long. You can put those slides up if you've got those, just the still slides, and those will be very important in this story. I'll start off asking you, how many of you have heard of a battle in history called the Battle of Thermopylae? I see a few heads nodding. Yeah. Battle of Thermopylae. You have, if you've heard of 300 Spartans, and not the movie 300, please. Entertaining, but that's all it was. It was not one of my favorite movies. The 300 Spartans, the Battle of Thermopylae, 480 BC. The Persians were invading Greece. There's always been some problems between the Greeks and the Persians. And some think as many as 1 million personnel the Persians were bringing in. And they were stopped at a narrow pass called Thermopylae by 300 Spartans, Greek warriors, the finest Greek warriors in existence, along with help from other Greek warriors, and they held them. They just stopped them at that pass. Wave after wave of the pest that the Persians could throw at them were held off by these 300 Spartans. In the end, they were betrayed. A way to come around from them from behind happened, and the Spartans were surrounded, and everyone to a man was killed, fighting bravely for what their nation, and in fact, they bought enough time for the Greeks to get their act together. There was a little trouble the Greeks were having at this time, and stand up and defeat, ultimately, the Persians and keep Greeks free. Now, just between you and I, Spartan society is not a society I recommend. If you read anything about Spartans, no, there's a lot of problems there. But as an ex-military man, I cannot help but to admire the bravery of these 300 men doing their job. But I want today, when you hear 300, when you hear about, even if you hear about the Spartans, that you think of Gideon's 300 instead. 700 years, about 700 years, before the Spartans fought, there were the 300 Israelites, or Gideon's 300. Okay? And we come to them in Judges 7, after we've seen in Judges chapter 6 how God has been developing Gideon, you could say. A reading from chapter 7. I like how it starts out. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and camped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was on the north side of them, by the hill of Morah in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, "The people who are with you are too many for me to give Midian into their hands. For Israel would become boastful, saying, 'My own power has delivered me.' Now therefore come, proclaim in the hearing of the people, saying, 'Whoever is afraid and trembling, let him return and depart from Mount Gilead.' So 32,000 people returned, but 10,000 remained. Then the Lord said to Gideon, 'The people are still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. Therefore it shall be that he of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, he shall go with you, but every one of whom I say, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go.' So he brought the people down to the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, 'You shall separate everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, as well as everyone who kneels to drink.' Now the number of those who lapped, putting their hand to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people kneeled to drink water. The Lord said to Gideon, 'I will deliver you with the 300 men who lapped, and will give the Midianites into your hands. So let all the other people go, each man to his home.' So the 300 men took the people's provisions and their trumpets, the shofars, into their hands. And Gideon sent all the other men of Israel, each to his tent, but retained the 300 men. And the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. Now the same night it came about that the Lord said to him," that is to Gideon, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hands. But if you are afraid to go down, go with Purah, your servant, down to the camp. And you will hear what they say. And afterward your hands will be strengthened, that you may go down against the camp." So he went with Purah, his servant, down to the outpost of the army that was at the camp. It was in the camp. Now the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the sons of all the sons of the east, that is, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as numerous as the sand of the sea. When Gideon came, behold, a man was relating a dream to his friend. He said, "Behold, I had a dream. A loaf of barley bread was tumbling into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it so that it fell, and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat." His friend replied, "This is nothing less than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given Midian and all the camp into his hand." Well, this is the soldiers of Midian saying this. When Gideon heard the account of the dream and its interpretation, he bowed in worship. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, "Arise, for the Lord has given the camp of Midian into your hands." He divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put trumpets and empty pitchers into the hands of all of them, with torches inside the pitchers. He said to them, "Look at me and do likewise, and behold, when I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I and all who are with me blow the trumpet, then you also blow the trumpets all around the camp, and say, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the pitchers that were in their hands. When the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers, they held their torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for the blowing, and cried, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Each stood in his place around the camp, and all the army crying out as they fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set the sword of one against another, even throughout the whole army. And the army fled as far as Bethshittah toward Zererah, and as far as the edge of Abel-Meholah by Tabbath. The men of Israel were summoned from Naphtali and Asher and all Manasseh, and they pursued Midian. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against Midian, and take the waters before them as far as Bethbarah and Jordan." So all the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they took the waters as far as Bethbarah and the Jordan. They captured the 2 leaders, Midian, Oreb and Zeb, and they killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb, and they killed Zeb at the winepress of Zeb, while they pursued Midian. And they brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon from across the Jordan. Long chapter there, but victory. God gave the victory. God provided the victory from the very beginning. In the first 3 chapters, we see here that, first of all, the first 7 chapters, God is refining Gideon's army. He's setting this military group up just the way he wants it. Okay? And so the fearful are removed, as it says. In verse 1, they're rising up, and the idea here with this word comes with it, we're ready to go. Let's get up and go. Yet, the Lord says, there are too many. And first of all, Israel will become boastful, saying, my power has delivered me. You notice that didn't seem to be a problem in chapter 4? Okay? It wasn't an issue that seemed to come up with Othniel, and Ehud, and Barak. But now we have this detail here of if there's too many people, Israel's going to take pride in this. Okay? Being boastful is to glorify themselves. They claim the glory for themselves. But here's the thing. The Hebrew phrase literally says they would claim glory for itself. Israel would claim glory for itself against me. In claiming the glory for themselves, they would be claiming it against the Lord God. Not a problem we have, right? You can do a whole sermon on pride. A little bit, I think, you got a kid that does something really well, yeah, they can have some pride in that. I don't think that's the problem. But, if you go out there and play a magnificent soccer game or sing wonderfully or whatever, don't forget who gave you those legs and those arms and that voice. Okay, anyway, can go so far on that. But Israel winning with this many troops would further distance them from Yahweh. Here's God to save them. Here we've seen this before. They fall into sin, they're doing evil, and God comes and rescues them. But now they're at a point in their evil where that if they seem to get too much credit or too much effort in the winning, it's going to drive them farther from God. There's Deacon and Brenda brought out about this spiral, where they sin and do evil and they cry out to God and God rescues them and they're back. Well, I'm going to suggest each time that spiral goes a little lower. And they come back, but then it goes even lower. And here we've got this situation here where Israel can be too self-reliant. Brent brought out last week something about how the, some of the motivations possibly, some of these, or week before anyway, how some of these Israelites might have motivations to turn to Baal, because their crops aren't doing so well, and they're looking for other ways to make things work, Not something we don't do in America. I don't have a problem with self-reliance. I don't want to speak against self-reliance, but we could certainly take it too far. As I raised my boys, something I told them all the time. Your greatest sins, more often than not always, but more often than not, your greatest sins are going to come from your greatest strengths taken too far. Your greatest weaknesses will be often your greatest strengths taken too far. Self-reliance can be a real problem in America. I still remember when Bruno was here. You remember Bruno, right? And something he said always stuck with me. He says, you Americans, you have a problem. The first thing you don't do is pray about it. You go after it, and it's good to be willing to roll up your sleeves, get to work, and solve the problem. But he says you have too much confidence in your ability to solve the problems. It sounds to me like this is where Israel was at this point, though they weren't solving their problems very well. But beware there of the self-reliance, okay? There's possibly a connection between excessive self-reliance and pagan inclinations, wanting to go after other sources than God, okay? Verse 3, now we come to this, proclaim in the hearing of the people, whoever's afraid and trembling. There's 2 words there. They're afraid, and not are they so afraid, they're trembling. Okay? Leave, go home, it's okay. 22,000 people, 2/3 of the force that was there departed. leaving 10,000. Now, here's another measure of how far Israel's come. If you go back to Barak and go back to the others, how many went home for fear? None. And it says in the text, these 22,000 were trembling with fear. Okay? There's another difference in Israel culture at this point. But he's got 10,000 men left. Who else had 10,000? Barak, right? In chapter 4, verse 14, Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him. Oh, good. So Gideon's down to 10,000, just like Barak. Things are going to go great, right? No, we know better. And I don't think this was an accident in the story. I think that this was intentional, that God had 10,000 staying behind to further prove, one, how much more Israel needed him, how much more deeply, intensely. I want to be careful here, saying you need God more or less. I'm not always comfortable with that. We need God, and we can't always quantify it. It's just, there's differences for each of us. But God comes along and does a final testing, a final winnowing in verse 4. There's still too many. Bring them down to the water, and I'll test them for you there. The ones who drink the water face down, and the ones who lap like a dog, in the text, it talks about bringing their hand up. Now, the suggestion has been made that the men who were kneeling down to the water and lifting it to their hands would be the kind of guys who would be more alert, because they got their head up, they can still look around, they're drinking the water. While the guy's face down sucking it up, all he sees is the water. Okay? Maybe I would say that. I don't think you have to believe that from this text. But what's interesting here is that God says, I will test them for you. God is doing the distinguishing here. And it's interesting that there's a different word here. Remember in chapter 6 when Gideon said, please let me test this? He used the word test. Okay? And here God says, I will test them for you. There's two different words. When Gideon was talking about testing God, he was being honest. He was trying God. He was showing doubt, a lack of faith. Okay? And that's in this word that's used for testing that Gideon used. But here, God uses the word test. It has the idea of, it's a different word. It still means to test, but in a sense of refining. Okay? Any of you know anything about refining metals, gold, silver, what have you? There's a lot of heat in the process. Okay? A lot of heat. And there can be a lot of hurt. I'm sure there's many in here who could testify to God needing to refine us by means that we're not always the most comfortable. And so God here is doing his kind of refining where he's testing us. Test me all you want, Lord, because I know you're refining me. And this is what he's doing here. And I would also say that in consistency with what he was doing with Gideon before, he's also meeting Israel where it's at. He's giving Israel what it needs. It starts when he says, oh, if they got too many, they're not going to trust me. They're going to think they won the battle and not me. He sees where Israel is spiritually, and he's meeting them where they're at. Bring them down to 300? You sure about that, Lord? Oh, yeah. He's meeting them where they're at with what they need. And so he brought the people down to the water, and you'll separate everyone who laps the water. And this was not a fleece test, if you want to call it that. It's, in a way, God's saying, here's the ones you pick. The ones who lap the water with their hand. And as we know, there were 300 left. 300 that did that. Not the 300 Spartans, but Gideon's 300. God's 300 to do the job at hand. And God said in verse 7, the Lord said to Gideon, I will deliver you with the 300 men who lapped and will give the Midianites into your hands. So let all the other people go, each man to his home. 9,700 men went home. And so now we come to the next part where we're going to get into the battle, starting here at verse 8 through 15, where God gives Gideon the encouragement that he needs. Okay? The 300 men, it says in verse 8, took the people's provisions and their trumpets into their hands. Interesting. They took the provisions, okay, the food, supplies, the things they needed, and the trumpets. Why aren't they mentioning, swords and spears and at least pitchforks and ox goads? Talked about those before. Okay? God's provision. Sometimes it's not what we think we need. Okay? I put down here, weapons. No farmers and tradesmen with pitchforks and ox goads, like I've said before. So there's an emphasis here on what they crucially needed. And we're starting to see how God is going to do some things differently. Okay? The shofars. There's not an emphasis here on military hardware and tactics. And we don't always need as much as we think we do, or what we think we do. Okay? Gideon, and this is a point of praise to Gideon, he followed God's directions. In some ways, perhaps he showed more faith than Barak. Barak had 10,000 men following him. He just requested Deborah follow him, and that was his weakness. But here's God winnowing down 32,000 troops to 300. Okay, what is that? Just math people help me. Is that 1%? Basically, it's less than 1%, right? Yeah. Okay. And so they had all they needed except for one thing, as we come to verse 9, and that was a confident leader. He was faithful, talking about Gideon, but he was having doubts. And what's interesting here, what just shows the love of God. In verse 9, now the same night it came about that the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hands. But if you're afraid to go down, go with Purah, your servant, down to the camp, and you will hear what they say, and I'll continue that. Okay? God doesn't even wait for Gideon to come along, Lord, to kind of do his fleece thing again. We don't have any record here that Gideon was praying and sharing his doubts and his fears with God. God knew it. And once again, God reaches out to him where he's at. Okay? It says, if you're fearful, go down to the camp. In a manner of speaking, I have some encouragement for you there. And Gideon, to his credit, obeyed the word of the Lord. God spoke to him. He did what God said to do. And we see what happens here. He went with Purah's servant down the outposts of the army. That was in the camp. God said he would strengthen him. Okay? And here's the final refinement. God is patiently growing Gideon's faith, as I already said. Gideon obeyed him. He obeyed the word of the Lord. It's a little simpler for us today. We have this printed book that we can go to and refer to. Okay? But I think that it's the same thing. Gideon was sensitive to what God had to say and obeyed it. Okay? In verse 12, now the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the sons of the east were lying in the valley, as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as numerous as the sand on the seashore. It says they were lying in the camp. They weren't encamped, they weren't posted, they weren't stationed, they were lying. They were at repose, they were calm, they were, hey, it's getting toward evening, we're going to go to bed. Yeah, they got their guards out and stuff like that. But they weren't expecting anything. They're expecting action. They've been doing this for some years, coming here and easily raiding the Israelites with their thousands of camels to carry off all the goods and leave the Israelites starving. Okay? They were lying. They were at ease. Hey, no problem. Okay? So, and then again we have the locusts and camels without numbers. One commentator speculated, I'm not sure how he came up with this figure, but said there was probably as many as 135,000 men there. And you got 300 going against that. Okay. So, and we come to verse 13, Gideon comes down. Behold, a man was relating a dream to his friend, and he said, I had a dream. A loaf of barley bread was tumbling into the camp of Midian, and it came to the tent and struck it so that it fell, and turned it upside down so that the tent lay flat. it's broadly agreed upon here that the barley represented Israel, and that the tent, the barley, barley is apparently a poor man's food in this context, and that Israel, of course, was quite impoverished by the continued raiding of the Midianites and the Amalekites, and the tent represents the nomadic Midianites and Amalekites, coming in, taking their stuff. And that barley bread knocks over the tent. It says, turned it upside down so that it lay flat. I've done a little camping. See, I understand Andrew's not here today. He does a lot of camping, and I think, Deacon, you've done some camping with him, right? And, yeah, if you're in the military, you're going to do some camping sometimes. I remember once I was in a big tent with 12 different guys. If that tent comes down, it's a catastrophe. It's a mess, okay? If you had that happen, or you forgot something, or you thought you had it, and then suddenly, or you're inside it, even worse. When that tent goes down, it's disorder. It's disorder. It's not supposed to happen. My favorite is this video of a tent that they didn't nail down. Maybe you've seen it. And the wind comes and you see this tent just blowing away. Okay? Like Dorothy's house, I guess. Yeah. Especially when it's a place where you're going to try to live comfortably. So his friend replied in verse 14, this is nothing less than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, the man of Israel. Gideon has given Midian and all the camp into his hand. I don't know. Somehow at this point, the Midianites have heard of Gideon. Word has gotten out. But now there's already a spirit of fear growing. God is at work. And he wanted Gideon to know that. He's encouraging Gideon, again, reaching out to him where he's at and saying, come here, you need some encouragement. Come and get it. And you heard this. There's fear in the camp. There's fear in the camp of the Midianites and Amalekites. I'm at work here. We're going to do this. Okay, be encouraged. And he was. When Gideon heard the account of the dream and its interpretation, he bowed in worship. And he returned to the camp of Israel and said, and I like how he says this, arise, for the Lord has given the camp of Midian into your hands. Not my hands, your hands. I think that Gideon shows some humbleness here, humility, as he says, not me, you. It's into your hands. A servant leader. Okay? If you look at Gideon and you look at how he grew, and I think you're seeing this, you see the recipe here for becoming an effective leader in the work of God. Okay? Not some conquering warlord like Alexander the Great or Caesar or Hannibal or others. Okay? But no, this man who doubted himself, but he didn't doubt God. Okay? And so, in 16, verse 16 now, 16 through 22, we have the third section here of the victory. Okay? He divided 300 men into 3 companies, put the trumpets and empty pitchers in the hands of all of them, with torches inside the pitchers. Again, not even a pitchfork or an ox goad? No swords, no shields? The Hebrew says empty pitcher to emphasize that it's just got the torch inside it and nothing else. We in the West were thinking, it's not empty if it's got a torch in it. Wait a minute. Well, it's just the way the Hebrew constructs, okay? Empty pitchers with torches inside, just to emphasize that's the only thing in there, okay? And so this is what's happening. Every man doesn't have a sword and a shield. They have a shofar and a clay pot pitcher with a torch inside it. That's obviously, from the text, already lit on fire. That's it. That's what you got in your hands. And you're going down here to a camp of well over 100,000 men, not to mention many, many thousands more camels and everything else, okay? And this is even less than Barak had. And I'm sure Barak is somewhere in their memory. And so he said to him, Gideon, look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. And when I and all who are there with me blow the trumpet, you'll also blow the trumpets all around the camp and say, for the Lord and for Gideon. Okay? This was a coordinated attack in which there was discipline to happen. And so Gideon, verse 19, and the 100 men were with him, came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just posted the watch, and they blew the trumpets and smashed the pitchers that were in their hands. They came at the shift change. Okay, we'll put it that way. Those of us who've been in the military, we know about, changing the watch. When I was a cop, we had 3 shifts. The day shift, the coveted day shift, the swing shift, which was like from 2 to 10 every night, which I kind of preferred, and then the midnight shift, 10 to 6 in the morning, okay? The dreaded midnight shift. I did all of them at one time or another. And when the shift changes, when the new troops come to take over from you, that can be a time of confusion. It can also be, to be fair about it, a bad time to attack, because suddenly you've got twice as many men there, okay? But everybody's, getting to their post and then coming back from their post and exchanging information with each other that they need and all this stuff. It can be a time of real confusion, not ineffective, but where you're just not alert to what's going on outside of getting to your post and doing all this stuff. So this is a great time to attack, okay? It'd be dark, there'd be some normal confusion as the men switch places. Verse 20, when the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the pitchers, they held the torches in their left hands and the trumpets in their right hands for blowing, and cried, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." They blew the trumpets. Okay, now I just got off the shift and went to bed. Okay, what's that? And I can imagine, apparently, the pots were to hide the glow of the torches as they came down. And now suddenly, smash, you got this light glowing, and trumpets sounding. And then a cry of a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. Okay? How many of you have heard of J. Vernon McGee? Dr. McGee, oh, good, yeah. Through the Bible Man. I couldn't help putting this in here. It's a little bit of a tangent, but he points out, some of us are not broken, and as a result, the light does not shine through. I don't think I need to develop that much. Okay. So we need to be broken sometimes before our light shines. That goes back, I think, to Israel being proud, willing to say, we saved ourselves. That kind of pride is not going to let God's light shine through. And therefore, he sent them all away except for 300. Okay. And when they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set the sword of one against another, even throughout the whole army. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah toward Zererah, and so on. As I look at the map on this, the Valley of Jezreel, kind of where they are, is about, if I remember, 70 miles north of Jerusalem. If you've ever seen the map, Jerusalem would be here, up here would be Jezreel, and Ephraim would be somewhere halfway between 30, 40 miles, So they have the victory. They've driven these guys out, okay? And there's a sequence here. The trumpets sound. Then there's the sound of the smashing pots as the torch lights come out, okay? And a cry of a sword for the Lord and Gideon. And the enemy runs crying out, and they sound the shofars again, and this time they start killing each other, fighting their own selves with their swords, okay? And I think that there's a purpose here, especially in 22, it's emphasizing when they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set the sword of one against another. What do trumpets do? What is their purpose, when you think of it in ancient times? Yeah, charge, call the charge, go out there and go get them. But isn't it also trumpets that play when the king arrives? Announcing the arrival of the king? And that's when God gets there with a vengeance and the fighting starts amongst themselves. When those horns are blowing. Okay? The king has arrived. Woe is you, Midian. Woe is you. Okay? I don't take any pleasure in saying that. But there it is. Okay? And the judgment of God begins. I say begins because this battle does continue into the next chapter. Okay? But here's an incredible victory. I try to imagine, what the 300 shofars would sound like. They wouldn't be in tune, okay? That would be harder for me as a musician to hear. I can only relate it to a rock concert. Sorry. I'll tell you, once there was an event with involved students at the school I was teaching at, and I knew some of these kids because they were Christians, they were believers. They had a prayer meeting in my room from time to time. And there was this event with some contemporary Christian group, local group, and I got directions to the place. It was somewhere in Raymore, and I wasn't sure of some of the directions, but as I got to a certain point in Raymore, I didn't need the directions anymore because I could hear it. I must have been more than a few miles away from it. I think I looked at my odometer. It was about 5 miles away from it, and I could hear it. I just followed the sound, and I didn't stay very long. Okay, I value my hearing. I think that 300 shofars must have been something like that. If you were asleep in bed, you were awake after those blew, and the vengeance of the Lord arrived. Okay, and it was the Lord. It says here. It's very specific. The Lord set the sword of one against another, even throughout the whole army. And I love it too. They're in disarray. I mean, I'm not the killing necessarily, but here you've got the 300, and they stand with discipline and peace and blow their horns in order, and the enemy is in terror and disorder. There's that disorder again. The tent falling down, well, what disorder? This was nothing like just a tent going down. It was symbolic. Okay. And so as we wind up this chapter here, we have in verses 23 and 24, reinforcements are summoned. Now, I think you can draw the conclusion that, let's see, 22,000 plus 9,000 is 31,000 plus 700, the 31,700 who left, they're out there now, and now they can come and do the Lord's work, destroying Midian and the Amalekites. Okay? Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim. We also have here that men of Israel were summoned from Naphtali, Asher, and Manasseh in that region. And all the men of Ephraim were summoned, and they took the waters as far as Beth-barah, recommended by Gideon for this fight. And they were mopping up. Now this was, what did I just say, 31,700 men who couldn't fight for God's reasons before. But because of Gideon's leadership, his humility, his faith as a leader, this enabled these men now to do a job for the Lord, spread out as they were throughout the region, coming after the Midianites who'd just been scattered by the 300. Okay? This is the fruit of a godly leader. Okay? And Midian's leaders were killed. This is significant, especially in those times when you lose the leaders, you are really, really on your way to losing the battle. Zeb and Oreb. Okay? It says here Zeb was killed at the winepress of Zeb. I believe that at the writing at the time, at the time this was written, this is kind of explaining, that winepress called Zeb? Well, here's why. Because this leader Zeb was killed there. Oh, and this rock of Oreb, okay? Well, it's called that because this guy Oreb was killed there way back when Gideon was saving us, was rescuing us. Okay? And so, I'm wrapping it up here. I appreciate your patience. And just some final points here. God gives us what we need. He meets us where we're at. That includes situations that we need. Sometimes he puts us in a situation that we need to be in. You don't need all those men. You just need these 300. Okay? And I put down here, maybe you need to work with less so that you can see God more. We do not test God. God tests us. When we're testing God, we're doubting. I thought about this one for a while, and it just brings home new to me the grace of God, because I've tested the Lord, and I'm realizing, wow, I've doubted him far more than I realize. Okay? He tests us, though. And isn't it amazing, in that testing, he's building our faith. In his testing, he's taking away our doubts. Number 3 here, claiming glory for ourselves can put us against God. Like I said, a little bit of pride in what you've worked. I don't think that's unreasonable. But who gave you the ability to accomplish what you accomplished? Number 4, God knows what we need before we ask. I just love how he says, go get him, Gideon, but if you're afraid, come on down and get some encouragement. I say God's hand is always out for that. Again, we Americans, we're going to take off and solve the problem, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but how many times do we need to look and see God's encouraging hand reaching out to us? Matthew 6:8, your Father knows what you need before you ask him. We know that verse. And one of my favorites, 1 Corinthians 10:13. Well, if you're writing this down, Matthew 6:8, your Father knows what you need before you ask him. 1 Corinthians 10:13, God is faithful. He will not let you be tried beyond what you are able to bear, but will, with the trial, also provide a way out so that you may be able to endure it. Okay? He took Gideon to its limits, I would say, but not past them. He knew where to meet him. Okay. Number 5, Gideon's leadership now made it possible for Israel to do the Lord's work. Now all those men he sent home, especially those fearful ones I think of, no doubt they knew what had happened. 300 men with just pitchers and shofars? Scattered all this? Wow, what a powerful God. And they went to work. Okay? Humility, obedience, trust, and the victory will be glorious. The 300 Spartans were armed as normal hoplites. I mean, the hoplite was the normal Greek warrior. They had breastplates and shields and swords, helmets, greaves, those metal shin guard things, okay? And spears. And stood alongside men just as well trained and armed as they were. Not to take anything away from their bravery. They were truly a well-equipped professional military. And they fought bravely against a superior enemy and sacrificed themselves. But they all died to a man. In contrast, you have 300 Israelites. And I hope from now on, whenever you hear about the 300 Spartans, you'll think about the Gideon's 300. Okay? Not even armed with pitchforks and ox goads. Are you tired of hearing me say that? I'm sorry. But carrying only shofars and pitchers holding a torch? They completely rout and defeat a vastly superior force and live to tell the tale. Live to be leaders in the peace that's to come, hopefully. Okay? With no less courage, I would say, than the Spartans, certainly, but with something even more. They had a courage built on faith in the true and living God, the one who is. Can we do no less?